Hey, this is Jon Leon Guerrero. Our guest today is Craig Johnson. He's a New York Times best-selling author with 15 novels, 2 novellas, and a pile of short stories, mostly about hard-scrabble lawmen fighting crime in the untamed plains and mountains of Wyoming. He's best known for creating the character of Walt Longmire, who is just such a lawman. He's not much for cell phones because there ain't exactly much coverage out in that open space, but he'll put you down and hog-tie you to bring you to justice. And I don't know if I'm talking about Walt or if I'm talking about Craig anymore. Anyway, co-hosting with Pete is another amazing author and our dear friend Jim DeFelice. Pete and Jim talk with Craig about being a man's man with a pen in his hand and his process of conveying a uniquely American experience. You're going to love this conversation. Here's our guest today, Craig Johnson.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland. This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is Jon Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Craig Johnson. I'm the New York Times bestselling author of the Walt Longmire series, and I'm really glad to be here on Break It Down.
And now, the Break It Down Show with Jon Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, the Break It Down show is proud to have Craig Johnson on. And we also have another New York Times bestseller on the line with us here because we have in-house author expert Jim DeFelice. And Jim likes the West just like Craig does. And before we go anywhere, I want to steal Craig's line that he says that his wife says about him. He wrote Longmire, and Longmire for Craig is the guy that he wants to be in about 10 years, except for he's getting us off to a slow start. I didn't say it as good as your wife does, but there's a lot of great stuff about you. There's a lot of great stuff about you out there. I want to not focus on the things that are out there like why Longmire and all that kind of thing and get into deeper topics. But just first off, thanks for coming out. You've got a new Longmire novel coming out, 15th novel, 2 novellas and a bunch of short stories. So there's a lot out there about you already on Longmire. And I'm just super stoked to have you on.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's a great thing to be here. Like, it's really nice to be able to do this from my ranch. Like, I live in, I guess my ranch is, just outside of a little town of 25 called Ucross. I'm in northern Wyoming. So any chance I get to do this type of thing where I actually get to sleep at home, I'm really kind of pleased with, I have to admit. So.
Well, since I have 2 authors, I'm going to mostly shut up and I'm going to let Jim ask questions because I can't imagine what you guys could talk about. So I'm going to get out of the way.
Well, actually, before we get to any sort of, deep questions, I want to know, Craig, when you say that you want to, that your character is who you want to be in 10 years, was that 10 years from book 1 or is it 10 years from now? Does it keep going?
Well, that kind of puts me on the spot because that means that I should have made some kind of advancement along those lines in the last 14 years, and I'm not so sure I have. I don't know. I mean, you get those kind of questions an awful lot of the time, and I show up, generally, wearing what I normally wear every day, whenever I'm doing book events. It's a pair of cowboy boots and jeans, and a hat, and so generally people are going to make some kind of a connection between the character and who you are. And I guess also the fact that I write Walt in first person, that I guess leads people to believe that maybe I am the character, but obviously I'm the lowly scribe who just writes about the character. And there are things that I admire in Walt. I mean, I think that whenever you're writing, there's always going to be certain aspects, especially of a fictitious character, that that you would like to aspire to. There are also things about him that that I don't aspire to. I mean, he's had a lot of tragedy in his life with the experiences that he had in the Vietnam War, like that with the death of his wife, of just a lot of things that he's had to deal with over the years that I really haven't. I've led a kind of a charmed life like that, and haven't had to deal with a lot of things that he has like that. But there are certain aspects of his character that I admire. I mean, he's very patient. He's very steadfast, he's dogged, he's very intelligent, he's extraordinarily well read, he's a smart guy like that. And so I like to think that a lot of the reasons why it is that people enjoy reading the books or watching the television show are the same reasons why it is that that I enjoy writing about Walt. He's a little bit different from a lot of the protagonists that you tend to see, in crime fiction. who tend to be the 6'2" of Twisted Steel and sex appeal kind of guy. I mean, Walt's a little bit, more like us. He's overweight, he's overage, he's overly depressed, but he still gets up in the morning and tries to do the job. And, to me, there's a heroism to that. In many ways, sometimes it kind of goes unsung. For me, that's one of the more appealing aspects of the character.
There are some parallels, and I realize that writers are always getting confused with their characters, but you were in law enforcement at one point too, right? Before you
I had a lot of experiences like that I think that you have to draw from like that. But, as you know, from being a writer like that, I mean, whenever you enter into something as specific, as a character or something, because that's kind of one of the elements that I was trying to get across whenever I even started with Walt, was something that was different, because I had read maybe not a lot of crime fiction, but enough to know that, the majority of it was about like detectives in big cities and all that type of stuff. And I was fortunate enough to run into 2 DCI investigators here in Wyoming, where we have, one crime lab. And I asked them, I said, how long does it take you guys to get, DNA evidence? And they said about 6 months. And I thought, okay, well, that certainly is a little bit different than, the way these type of things are usually portrayed, and so I thought, well, what if you did the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state? It would kind of force you to, focus more on character and place, which I think are, where the real writing comes from. And so that's kind of, the direction that I went. And so an awful lot of the personal experience that I drew for the character was helpful. But what was even more helpful was doing ride-alongs with the sheriffs, here in Wyoming and up in Montana. There are counties, in both of these states, certainly maybe more so in Wyoming, where, we have counties that are the size of New Hampshire or, Vermont, or I think Fremont County is like the size of Maryland. And, you have limited resources, and limited funding, to do the type of things that, I don't know, you see on television or you see in books and everything. And, it's always going to come down to the money. What can you afford to do, as a county sheriff? And, that seemed to kind of like draw me into an area that I thought where the writing might be better than just being plot driven. One of the terms I think I hate more than any other one in writing is the page turner. I really don't like that term, because it seems to me that all you're trying to do is get somebody to just rush through your book as you go through the gymnastics of some plot, then finish it up, and people will set that book down and, maybe it was a hectic and wild ride, but are they going to remember anything from that? There's I'm not going to give away names, but whenever I'm on tour, one of my favorite things to do is look and see, which books are the most abandoned, on airlines, like which ones are stuffed, in the back, the pouch of the seats there, to see who gets, abandoned. And there's this one author that gets abandoned more than any other I've ever seen. And one time there was a woman sitting across the aisle from me who happened to be reading one of those books, and she finished it up. And I said, "So how was your book?" And she goes, "It was great. It was really, really good." And I said, "Wow, so what is it about?" And she goes, it was, there was a boat in it and there was a guy. And I was like, okay, boy, I don't ever want that to happen when somebody finishes my book. I would rather have them, remember a few details, rather than, that it was, a wild ride and, 300 pages and now it's done and I can't remember what it was about, more than 2 minutes later.
I have to ask you, though, given that little story there, have you ever come across anybody that's been, whether it on a plane or the diner, wherever, have you ever come across somebody reading your book, and what happens if they didn't know who you were? Do you strike up a conversation or do anything?
I'm not that bold. I'm really not. I've actually, run into a few people who've actually been reading my books, but I haven't had the nerve to say, how was the book or something like that. I'm not quite sure if I don't know, maybe I'm not brave enough to hear what they say, or something like, this is lousy. Everyone I'm trying to finish it at all like that. But no, I've had a couple. There was actually, I think there was the only time that I ever did it, there was a gas station in Hardin, Montana, and there was a copy of Cowboys and Indians magazine, and I had a short story that won the Tony Hillerman Award and was actually in that month's issue. And when I came in to pay for my gas, the young woman was sitting there at the counter, and she had that Cowboys and Indians magazine open and was reading the short story. And I looked at her and I go, is this your magazine? Are you reading it? And she goes, yeah. I look at it and I said, well, is it the short story? Is it any good? And she goes, yeah, it's pretty good. Look at, and that's all she said. And I was like, okay,
Thank
good.
God.
That's all. Well, I'll take that and run with it. Like, that's what I'll do. So I don't know. Maybe that had an effect on my ability to actually, to ask those questions anymore. I thought, okay, you got a base hit. Just take it and run with it. Okay.
So, Craig, my next question then is all of us artists, these creators, oftentimes our tightest circle are the hardest people to sell things to, like in my hometown. Yes, people listen to the show, but like it should be like crazy, the show's really successful, but it's not, and I'll say, hey, have you listened to the show? I don't care if you have or haven't, but have you? And they're like, oh yeah. What's your favorite episode? All right, I haven't listened, So can you sell books in Ucross or like I just can't sell 2 books in Ucross?
Well, my grandfather used to have the best phrase about that, which was biblical, which is the prophet hath no honor in his own country. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's like, around here, it's not Craig the writer. It's like, oh yeah, Craig, you got that ranch, out near Ucross, and they're more concerned about me making sure that I get my fences, fixed than they are about, the next book, or the next episode of, the TV show or anything. I do pretty well like that. I mean, like in Buffalo, which is about 20 miles away, there's a bookstore, and then in Sheridan, the other direction, 28 miles away, there's another bookstore, and then they sell my books, pretty briskly like that. But then again, we also have a lot of tourism in the state of Wyoming, and there are a lot of people that come through on their way, from the Black Hills headed over to Yellowstone like that, and so they're always looking for local authors and local literature like that. And that can work sometimes for you, and sometimes it can't, and so. I think one of the things that kind of hedges the bets a little bit is that it's a big publisher. It's it says that they're New York Times best-selling books. There's a TV show on Netflix, and so they'll take a chance to maybe pick up that book and maybe read it. They might not get burnt as badly as they might get burnt with what I tend to refer to as my uncle's branding in 1948 was the greatest time ever, and I've written a 48-page self-published book about it, and will you introduce me to your agent, kind of situation where, it's going to be a little bit a harder sell, I guess, to try and to get out there like that. But I mean, that's always going to be the big question too, like that whenever whenever you do write, or whenever you hope to get published or anything along those lines, the getting published is not a dirty word. There are a lot of literary workshops, and places you go like that, and you get a lot of that nebulous, well, I just write to write, and I just write to discover things about myself. That's all fine and well, and that's great, but if you really want to be a writer, and you really want to get a message out there, then, you're going to have to get an agent. You're going to have to get a publisher. You're going to have to go out and go on tour. You're going to have to do all of those things, that come along with doing the writing. And, I'm always, whenever I'm doing workshops or, dealing with, young writers, and their first question is, well, what's it like to go have a beer with Lou Diamond Phillips, or what's it like to be on tour in France, or things like that. I'm always thinking to myself, okay, you're only talking about 5% of, of what writing is really about. I mean, the majority of what you're doing is going to be sitting in an empty room with your imaginary friends and typing about them. And so if you're not really comfortable with the idea of doing that, then, you're probably going to have a problem on your hands. But I don't know. I mean, it's, also a question of like, you make choices, and so whenever I decided to write about this guy, who was, the sheriff of the least populated county, least populated state, I knew it was kind of maybe going to go in a different direction than the majority of the stuff that was out there. And that's a choice that you have to make, early on too, since, there's something like, I think 250 hardback mystery novels published a month. And so to be seen, in that herd, or to be noticed in that herd, you better think about doing something different. And that's what it all boils down to, trying to do something different, I think.
Yeah. From having a lot of authors on the show, I've learned this thing, like writing of the book it's exceptionally hard. And one of the hardest things you've done in your life, that first time you do it. Now, welcome to the, holy crap, it's even harder to sell this thing, Like it's the hardest thing ever.
Or or the best thing in the world happens and you actually do get picked up, and the next thing they say is we need another book in 6 months.
Yeah.
And now we need another one in 6 months, and another one in 6 months, and another one in 6 months. But I mean, it's like first world problems. I mean, you don't ever want to be too critical of the situation like that, because boy, how wonderful is it to have all of this stuff happen, and to have people be interested. I mean, to have a marvelous show like yourself, like contact me and say, hey, can we get on here and can we talk? I mean, there were all of those years, where you're out there just swimming in the ocean without a life preserver, typing away every day and thinking to yourself, is this ever going to amount to anything? Is it ever going to go anywhere? Is anybody ever going to be remotely interested in reading this stuff? And so there's a girding of the loins, I think, that you have to have, to do this kind of thing for a living. There's got to be a certain amount of mental toughness, that has to go along, and a hope, and a belief, in what it is that you're doing. And nothing is as hard as that first one. Nothing is as hard as that first one, trying to get that done.
Except for the next
story
one.
that I always, but at least you're not reinventing the wheel. At least at that point, you've actually said to yourself, okay, well, I have actually done this. I've just got a much shorter timeline, to try and do it. Is all.
Yeah.
So,
Between the two of you guys have written
easier before, though.
Yeah.
I want to know, how about some of your pre-Longmire history? I mean, because I think some people think, he just popped into existence, and what kind of led you to your success, actually, I guess would be the way really to phrase that, huh?
Then you have to look at it and say to yourself, well, then you have to consider yourself a success, which I think is a big mistake. I think along the way, I think an awful lot of the time that whenever I used to make the joke that whenever your name was bigger than the title of your book, you were done. Your artistic aspects of your writing life, were pretty much over. And now that my name is bigger than the title of my books, I have to take all that back. So at least in hopes, that there's still some, some artistic, credibility to what it is that you do. I think that, my education, was in writing, but I think also the big thing for me was that I came from a family of storytellers, that really would sit in rocking chairs, on front porches, or be sitting there snapping green beans or whatever. And, they would tell stories like that. And so I very early on learned that, somebody who could tell a story, that was a very valuable, commodity. That was a very valuable trait. I mean, being able to rebuild a small block engine, being able to prepare a wonderful meal or stitch up a star quilt, be able to, do basic electricity or, plumbing or carpentry and all that. These are all valuable abilities. And just telling a good story, knowing how to tell a good story was another one of those things that I think, was kind of important. And that's kind of the way I approach the books, is that, it would be almost as if you were to go in and sit down in the Busy Bee Cafe in Durant, in this fictitious town, in this fictitious county, and Longmire were to come in and sit down next to you and turn to you and say, let me tell you about what happened to me last month. At that point, I don't even want you to be aware that you're reading a book. I want you to fall into that world and be a part of it. And I don't know. I mean, you got to trust your instincts, and think that, what you're doing is the right thing, and that you're going to try and do something a little bit different, maybe than, what everybody else is doing out there. But I don't know if there's ever really a point in time. I mean, I just got the advanced reader copies from the new book, Land of Wolves, that's going to be out on September 17th. And, you always think that people will ask that question. They'll say, well, when did you know you'd succeeded? When did you know, that this was, I don't know if that ever really happens. I think that there's, I guess what I tend to refer to as a creative dissatisfaction, in the sense that, you write something or you create something like that, but you're never completely happy with it. I had a good friend of mine, Mark Sprague, who wrote An Unfinished Life, and a number of other books, from over in Cody. And I remember sitting in a bar with him one time drinking a beer, and he reaches over and takes a hold of one, the book that I had sitting on the table between us. And he goes, you know what you don't ever want to have happen, Craig? And I said, no, what's that? You don't ever want to pick up one of your books. And he picks up the book as an example. And he opens it up to a page and looks at it and goes, a great man wrote that. You don't ever want to get to that point where you read your stuff, and you start believing your own press, where you're like, yes, I am a magnificent writer, aren't I? And I think any kind of artist, I think that there's got to be that dissatisfaction. I think there's always got to be that, oh, well, what's your best book you've ever written? Well, I haven't written it yet. What's the best painting you've ever painted? I haven't painted it yet. The best song you've ever written, I haven't recorded it yet. I think got to feel like, you're moving towards something, that you're actually attempting to try and do, something different and something better each time. And that kind of goes into the other aspect of it, that's a little bit dangerous when you're writing a series, is that, we've all started series of books, because writing a singular book, a standalone book, and writing a series, that's two very different breeds of cat. And I think, that you can fall into a lot of traps, whenever you start getting on what I tend to refer to as that gerbil wheel of, putting out a book every year. You better try and do something different with each one. There's a danger to that, because there are a lot of people that, picked up your first book because they really, really like that. And they may want you, as readers, to reproduce that book, to keep doing it over and over and over again. And there are a lot of publishers and agents, who would be very happy. There are tons of authors out there like that who were very, very popular, like at it, and their first book, really was a breakthrough book, and they just keep doing that same book over and over and over again. I desperately don't want to be, one of those authors. I want to try new things. I want to challenge myself, as an author to try and, write different things, like to deal with different social situations, all of these different things, have the characters grow, have them develop, have them change over a period of time. I think that can be the death of any series of books. I mean, whenever you pick up the first book and you really enjoyed it, and then you go and pick up the 17th book and the characters are still saying and doing the same things that they did, 17 years ago, that's just not normal. That's not human.
What was the evolution? Have you consciously plotted out, okay, well, I'm going to keep myself fresh by doing this, or how exactly has that worked over 15 books?
It's tough. I mean, it's and you use different things. You use different ways. Obviously, the first thing you do whenever you sit out, in my opinion, I don't know, this is just the methods that I use. I'm always thinking to myself, well, what are you trying to say with this book? What is it what's the message that you're trying to get across, to the readership? What are you trying to convey? And then you have to start thinking about a couple of different other things. Okay, well, what's the plot? What are the mechanics of the storyline or investigation that are going to illustrate this message that you're trying to get across? And then, like, where are these characters? Where are they? In their evolution right now? Like, for me, I'm writing about a Vietnam veteran, like that. He's of a certain age, and got a certain the relationships that he's dealing with, the things that he's getting over, the new challenges that he's facing, in his life, all of these things. Well, what's the storyline and what's the message like that that's going to illustrate that and allow me to evolve that character in that sense.
When it comes to characters, we've had Kat Connor on the show, and she's got her own series called the Bite series, and she talks about the people that she writes about. They're her friends also. So have you and Walt sat down and had a beer? Like, how do you, outside of the book, and obviously I don't mean literally, but as you're creating this universe, have you had that experience? She has music. Oftentimes pops into her head, and it kind of themes a character or a situation for her. How does that work for you?
Maybe I have to admit that maybe Walt might be the only one that I haven't, like that, but and I don't know quite what that means. Like, other than but I do have to admit that one of my favorite quotes on writing is the one from Wallace Stegner on Writing and Teaching Fiction, where he says the greatest piece of fiction ever written is the disclaimer at the beginning of every book that says nobody in this book is based off anybody alive or dead. Yeah. That what a crock that is. That's your job, is to go out and find interesting people and populate your novels with them, like that. And yeah, I think that obviously there's so many wonderful shortcuts that you can use, like in the development of character, and I love doing that. I love using people in my books, and 9 times out of 10 people have absolutely no idea who they are in your books. Like, I remember when I was writing the first Walt book, The Cold Dish, like I had the character of Lucian Connolly, who is the older sheriff that Walt goes and plays chess with on Tuesday nights at the home for assisted living. Like, and I remember sending the manuscript to my brother, like that, to let him read it. And, he called me immediately upon finishing it. And I said, well, what did you think of it? He goes, you're dead. And I said, what do you mean? Like, and he goes, the old sheriff, the one that Walt goes and plays chess with on Tuesday night, that's our dad, Craig. And I was like, crap, I thought I hit that really, really well. He said, no. He said, he looks like Dad. He acts like Dad. He talks like Dad. The only thing you did was change his name and cut off one of his legs. And I don't think it's going to work. I think it's not going to fool Dad. And so I waited with bated breath because I had also sent a copy to my mother and father like that. And, I called up my mother and she's, I said, Mom, has Dad read the book yet? She's like, he's about halfway through it. He's really enjoying it. And I said, well, good. And I'm trying to think of how I'm going to ask this next question.
Yeah.
And that's when she comes back on and says, honey, your father thinks he's Walt Longmire. And I was like, okay.
Perfect.
I was stunned, because I can't imagine two characters any further apart than those two characters. And her statement was, let's not disabuse him of that thought. And so he pretty much went to his grave pretty sure that he was Walt Longmire. But I don't know. My wife has some really, astute observations about that too. And she says, well, you say you pull all of these other characters, from other people and everything, but in the final analysis, you're the only one that's in the room. You really got to pull from yourself, and to try and, develop those characters, and I hear a lot of authors, they'll say, oh, well, I have my characters and they just speak to me and they start talking and they just, run off with the storylines and everything. And I don't know. I worry about people who sit in rooms by themselves and hear voices. I don't know. And, I write about armed people an awful lot of the time, and that worries me even more when they hear voices again. Yeah. So I've got a theory on that. And you can see what you think like that. But my theory is that, you've got, two minds in here. You've got your conscious mind and your subconscious mind. And your conscious mind is the one that's doing all of the research. It's the one that's doing all the outlines. It's the one that's got the fingers on the keyboard and all of this, and has a mind of like, what the structure of the plot is and all of these things. And then you've got your poor subconscious mind, which is just kind of like a backseat driver that you just kind of like back there along for the ride, and really can't reach the steering wheel, can't reach the brake or the accelerator, anything like that. But like any other backseat driver has opinions, and maybe, might have even, a more, liquid idea, of, these characters and a flowing idea of like the pacing and the structure of the novel, like, as far as that's concerned. And so like any other backseat driver, every once in a while, it throws something over the seat, to kind of like let you acknowledge, like, and deal with. And I think that, a lot of times that's what it is. It's not really all that spooky or otherworldly. It's just your subconscious mind kind of reminding you of maybe some plot points or other things that maybe you might otherwise not be aware of.
Before we get too much further, I want to ask you about the new book that's coming out this fall, and just maybe give us a sneak peek or give us a little reason on that to read
Sure.
on.
This one is it was a fun book to do like that, because the last I guess 5 books have kind of led to a culmination for Depth of Winter with Walt, probably in one of the most desperate situations probably of his life like that. But the majority of that book actually took place in Mexico with these drug cartels. And it was another opportunity to try and do something different, with the books once again, but then, you can't truly go home, but you certainly have to, because you can't sleep here like it. And so, Walt ends up, going, back to Absaroka County after solving the issues that he has to deal with, in Mexico. And as it is with a lot of these situations, when you're in a situation that really calls for a lot of inherent violence and things that Walt hasn't dealt with, in some ways, since Vietnam, like that, he finally gets back, to Absaroka County, in Wyoming, and it's a strange landscape for him. In many ways, he doesn't recognize it anymore the way that he used to. There's even a point in time, when he's talking to Isaac Bloomfield over at the hospital, just, he's involved in this investigation about a shepherd who may or may not have, sagebrushed, or is the term that we use here in Wyoming, where, you're out alone by yourself for too long, and he commits suicide is what he does like that. And, Walt, is going through the medical information with Isaac Bloomfield like that, and then he's explaining this situation where he has these moments where he's just kind of freezing up for minutes at a time, where he just doesn't move or anything and just, stares off into the distance. And, and Isaac's explaining to him, he says, well, there's always, you've heard of the flight, fight, mechanism like that, response. And Walt's like, well, yeah, I like it. And he goes, well, obviously, you have, 2 responses to something that you perceive as a threat. You either, fight or you flee like it. And he said, sometimes, if, the situation and the threat is so overwhelming that we can neither fight nor flee, we literally freeze up. And, Walt's looking at him and he's saying, well, yeah, but if that's the case, then what the hell is it, Doc, that I'm so afraid of? Like that. And Isaac Bloomfield looks at him and says, why, Walt, I would have thought that it was perfectly obvious. It's yourself. The individual that Walt had to be to do the things that he had to do in depth of winter in Mexico, they're impairing him now in his ability to come back and be who he was in Wyoming. And so he's having difficulties dealing with this situation. And so there's a case, that he's dealing with, an investigation where there's a Basque shepherd up in the Bighorn Mountains, like that, who, as I say, gets bushwhacked, or not bushwhacked, but sagebrushed, and hangs himself like that. And so they go up to investigate the body and discover that, well, maybe he committed suicide, maybe he didn't. Maybe there's some mitigating circumstances that might lead to somebody, maybe killing him. And then, of course, to complicate, matters, as it turns out, there's evidently there's been some predation, where a wolf, who's come out from the Lamar Valley and the Yellowstone region over into the Bighorn Mountains, has nibbled on this hanging shepherd, which kind of throws some repercussions through the town, that there's a wolf scare and that there are wolves, around, every tree that are waiting to drag, every child from a bus stop, here in Durant, and makes for even more complications for Walt. And the wolf, as it turns out, is an older alpha male that's, been kicked off from one of the packs, and he's kind of crippled up, but he's of good size, and a little older, and having some trouble and gray around the muzzle and all this. And amazingly enough, our crippled up older sheriff, finds a certain amount of, of a connection with this wolf like that. And so, it's back to the complications, of a sheriff in Wyoming. And the title actually comes from a Basque proverb that a land of strangers is a land of wolves. And it's been a fun book to write, because Walt's, back in his element in Wyoming. And I have to admit that, that even though I enjoy the books, that take place in different locales, it's always a joy to return back to Wyoming.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business, or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
Even though I enjoy the books, that take place in different locales, it's always a joy to return back to Wyoming.
I wanted to ask you, Tony Tost has been on the show, and obviously you guys kind of get that region of the nation that you're writing about. Have you had an opportunity to really kind of dig into how he sees your world?
Only from reading his writing, more than anything else. He was one of our staff writers on Longmire, and I don't know. I mean, in many ways, I admire, all of the writers that we had on the TV show, because they're able to do something that I'm incapable of doing. I go up into my loft here in my little ranch here in Wyoming, and, I write, all by myself. They had more of a write by committee kind of situation, with the producers and the directors and even the input, from the actors once the scripts finally got there like that. And I don't work and play well with others. I like going up there all by myself like that. And I'm just amazed, at how they were able, to work, with all of these influences, and it's so weird. Hollywood is so strange in the sense that, there was a point in time when Dodge Trucks was desperate to try and get rid of that Ford Bronco that they had on the television show, where, even the advertisers, were having input, as to how the screenplays or teleplays were to be written. And to give, Tony, a really, a salute, what was very obvious to me whenever I would, because I was an executive creative consultant on the show, which means I know where the porta potties are on set, was what that meant. But one of the things they would do is they would send me the scripts to go through, because I'm not going to be able to help them, with the costuming or the setting or the acting or the directing or all these different things like that. But I can help them with that world. And, more importantly, I could help them, with the language and the writing of that world. And what was interesting to me was it was apparent to me almost instantaneously whenever I would receive one of the scripts, whether or not the screenwriter had read my books. And Tony was one of the best. He was actually one of the best. You could tell immediately when, you read his scripts that he had read all of the books, that he knew the world that I had created. And that's very flattering. You think that, that it would be pretty obvious that if you're going to attempt to do something along these lines, that, you would want to read as much of the seminal material as there is, so that you can draw from that. And he did an absolutely magnificent job doing that. But then there were other times when I would read the works of some of the screenwriters, and I could tell, no, they did not, know the lay of the land. They didn't know the books, and maybe even more importantly, they didn't know Wyoming. I would catch things like, they would have, screenwriters write things like, okay, well, we're going to, run down to Denver and we'll be back in a couple of hours. And I'd be like, no, you're not. Unless that, Absaroka County Sheriff's Department Learjet is available, you're not going to be doing that, and so kudos to Tony, like in so many ways, A, for being such a wonderful writer, but B, also, for circumspect like that he, really would delve into it like that and try and find as much material as he could, to draw from like that, to work on his scripts.
We've touched on this, or you've touched on this rather a couple of times, about place and how important place is in the books, obviously the TV series. But I also wonder, how much it informs just, your writing itself, kind of your, not to get too esoteric here, but, your existence and kind of the interplay there. I mean, obviously place is important in some way to you.
Well, yeah. I mean, my favorite quote on that is the old Studs Terkel line that nothing ever happened nowhere. You really got to make sure like that, if you're going to take that on, that, that you make sure that you get it right. And, because it's not that difficult to be an expert on Wyoming. I mean, there aren't that many, I have to admit, now granted, I will concede the point that there are only 500,000 of us like that live here. There is a very much a tone to it and a feel to it, like to the high plains, to the American West, especially the contemporary American West. That's a tricky business. Like and then, trying to write something, as far as like, the period West is concerned, that's even more, conspicuous, because you're going to have people that are going to have, specific ideas about, certain things like that. And, as you well know, as being an author, like that, if you get something wrong, they are more than happy to get in touch with you and tell you all about the things that you got wrong. Okay. And maybe you did, maybe you didn't, maybe it's an opinion thing or whatever like that. But, there really isn't any excuse anymore to not, try and make sure that you get that information right. And I think the ambiance, of, the high plains and of the Rocky Mountain West, it's just not something that I can leave out of the books. One aspect of it being so much so that, I think it was James Crumley that, that wrote that Wyoming has never been about, indoors. Wyoming has always been about the out of doors because there is so much of it. The ninth largest state, with the smallest population base. And so, one of the aspects of, doing this interview, it was funny, like, I had to go back and forth like that because, there is no internet, the internet service here, at the ranch it's a little dicey sometimes. Like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Skype, is 9 times out of 10, not so much of an option. Cell phones don't work. I mean, I actually like writing about a world, where the limitations of technology become very, very evident. I think one of the mistakes that that we as modern people make is that technology can solve all of our problems. Well, the natural world has a way of reminding you that technology has its limits. And right when you start depending on it the most, that's when it will leave you flat. And, it's funny because people are always asking me, why is it that Walt doesn't have a cell phone? And my immediate response is, you don't live in Wyoming, do you?
Right.
Because, it becomes pretty evident pretty quick, why it is. We had this thing called Longmire Days, like in Buffalo, which is kind of the basis for Durant, and it's a little 5,000 person town at the base of the Bighorn Mountains here in northern Wyoming. And it's an event where we have all of the actors from the television show come up for this one weekend. I think it's like the third weekend in July, I think, this year. And, the actors all show up, and they bring about 20,000 of their closest friends with them. And it's kind of like a FEMA disaster is what it's like because all the restaurants and all the grocery stores run out of food, all the ATMs and banks run out of money, and everybody walks around with their cell phones looking at the little blue circle of death, because they've overrun the bandwidth of the one little tower that there is, there in Buffalo. And of course, my favorite thing is to walk up to them and going, yeah, now you know why Walt doesn't carry a cell phone, don't you? But for me, that's part of the joy of it, like that, to have a specific, geography, to have a specific area, to write from. I mean, we're in April now, and people are contacting me about doing events and all these type of things, and it's still winter. It was snowing last night, and the wind was blowing at about I'm not joking, at about 64 miles an hour towards some of the trim off of the edge of one of my buildings here at the ranch. And so it's whenever you've got a world where it imposes itself in your life on a day-to-day basis, well, then you'd be a fool to not have that be a part of of what it is that you're writing, because it's certainly a part of Walt's life. There's no choice.
So do you find kind of a dissonance or some sort of distance between the TV series and the books? I mean, you were saying, basically you're writing and that's kind of your own thing, and then the TV is something else, and yet there's a connection and kind of, a symbiote. Well, I don't know, you describe it.
I think that, whenever you go into, and from your experiences, this is true, like that. I mean, you're talking about another art form is what you're talking about. We've all heard, the horror stories, going all the way back to the annals of the history of Hollywood, of disgruntled authors, who weren't happy, with the way that, the movies or the TV shows or whatever of their work were done. And I kind of put a little bit of blame, on both sides. I mean, obviously, there are enough unscrupulous individuals, and Hollywood's kind of like drugs. There's a lot of money, so there's a lot of unscrupulous characters that are going to be involved, and so, you really got to kind of protect yourself by trying to work with the very best people that you can. And, the only choice that you have in those situations is before you sign, your name on the contract. I'm always unimpressed with authors who take, the multi-million-dollar contracts and then badmouth, the material later. It's like, well, you maybe should have done a little bit more, homework, on who it was that you were working with, and see what kind of work they do before being all upset, with what it is that they did, with your work. I think, that it's, like I said, a different breed of cat. It's just, what works in a book is not necessarily going to work in a television show, or in a movie. You just have to try and, find a compatibility and try and work with the very best people that you can work with, and then realize that there are going to be, changes that are going to be made. With the people with Longmire, they had, really wonderful track records on all of these television shows that they had done. Nip Tuck, I can go through the whole list of like all of these things that they had done, but they had a good track record. And so I thought, okay, then maybe this is something that we can, work together and do. And I also remember one of the first meetings that I had with the producers, with the head producer, Greer Shepard. One of the first things she said to me was, your books don't break down to a 42-minute teleplay very easily. And my immediate response to that was, thank God. If they did, you really shouldn't be reading them like that. And so, I knew right then, and they said, well, can't, fit one of your books into, a single episode. We just can't do it. And, with it being on basic cable, when it was on A&E, they exerted a certain amount of force, that each episode should have a beginning, a middle, and end. And right now, like that, the way the trends are running is that you have a case and a situation that'll run an entire season like that. But, whenever we were starting out, they kind of flexed their muscles and said, no, we want people to be able to start in on episode 10 and still be able to realize what's going on. But now with the streaming situation being the way it was, that format kind of changed a lot when we switched over and went with Netflix. But I think, you have to kind of be open to the idea that, that these people hopefully are going to know what they're doing, and be open to the idea that it might be a little bit different from what it is that, that you had in mind. some of the differences, being that, the Walt in the books is obviously a little bit older, and Henry is a little bit older. And that was actually, I guess, maybe the first, controversy that I had, with the producers. We were in one of the meetings and they said, well, we're thinking about making Walt and Henry about 10 years younger than they are in the books, where they're Vietnam veterans. And I had the immediate redneck cowboy, author response where I was like, well, now why are we doing that? And they said, well, because we'd really like to, run the show for about 10 years or so, and we'd rather not have the characters on walkers, by the time we get to the end, and so I had a hard time arguing that point. I kind of pulled my horns back in and, kind of realized what it is that they were attempting to do. I think you kind of just have to be open to that.
Boy, is that a producer's answer, though, man. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, they have to think about things that, maybe the author, I never entertained, my thought process, I was amazed that they were even thinking about making a television show out of the sheriff of the least populated county, the least populated state. I literally questioned, do you guys think this is a good idea? Do you really? And it was nice too, like that, because, Greer came back, with a response to that, and she had said, well, the thing we like about Walt is that he's got a code that he lives by, that he's, a genuine, good guy who cares, about the people, that are in his constituency, that are in his county. And she said, we've kind of gone through this, anti-hero thing that's been going on, since the 1960s or so. And she said, I feel like, that maybe people are ready, for a guy who's going to do the right thing, that actually cares about people and, isn't going to be making meth, in his bathtub or burying bodies in the backyard or something. And I think she was right. She kind of tapped into a little bit of that zeitgeist that made for a little bit of the response to the television show. And certainly I oppose, to the books too. And you got to have a big picture kind of idea, I think, to do that kind of work. Be able to work with, all of those different people and all those different entities, of getting a studio to bite, and getting them to want to make, a pilot, and then getting an advertisers to jump on board like that. Once you get, a channel like that or a network to actually bite and think about making it into a series. It's a lot of hurdles to overcome. In some ways, I guess it could be, compared, with getting an agent and getting a publisher, and then, getting enough of them into enough bookstores, to where you start actually getting some traction and the book starts to sell like that. But it's a business aspect, I guess maybe that I, would rather not have to contend with, to be honest. I'd rather focus on the writing myself.
You were talking before about, binge watching and, how somebody comes into a series and stuff. What about now with the books? If I'm a reader and I've never, I hear this podcast for the first time and I've never heard anything about the TV series, the books or something, can I start anywhere? Should I start with number one? Where should readers jump in?
I think, that's, one of the challenges, of writing a series is that you do have to be able to have that continuation of the characters and their world like that. But I do think, you also have to make, each book has to be accessible. Each novel has to be something that somebody, is just wandering through the airport like that, and they have a 4-hour layover like that, and they're desperate for a book, and they see yours and they pick it up, that they're not going to throw it down after, getting about 20 pages in because they don't understand anything that's going on, So I think it's a tightrope that you have to walk. And sometimes you're more successful than you are in others. I think there are probably only 2 books in the series that I would say, you shouldn't start with. But you're always hoping that there are going to be enough of that first book out there. The thing I'm always advising people is if you think that these characters and this place are something that you're really going to want to, read the entirety of the series, then go back and try and grab that first book, The Cold Dish, to get yourself started. But certainly there's no reason why it is that anyone couldn't pick up The Land of Wolves to get started on it. If anything, it'll just make you more curious about, who Walt is and who Vic is and who Henry is and where all these characters came from and where it is that they're going.
I was just going to say that, it seems to me one thing that you really do really well is I think the series is very accessible no matter where you come in, which I know is a huge challenge. So I would say anybody listening to this and, is interested, just whatever book you see in the store, you go ahead and grab it and get going.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Like it's. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where it's an ugly beast that rears its head once you're already, on board. Because you start writing books, in a series like that, and then some of those challenges just kind of have to either rise to them or else, you continue at your own peril. I think that's always going to be on your mind like that. But then it kind of goes to that core of the writing process too, like that. I mean, whenever I'm teaching classes or doing a workshop or something, I'll tell students, if the example I always use is the red hot gun barrel swung around under the looming mountains, the gun barrel's always red hot and the mountains are always looming like that. And so, you're going to have to find a new way to say this. I think that's, kind of the challenge. What you hope is going to be good writing, that, you got to find a different way to say something. And, and that can even go into a larger scale, whenever you're going back, and reiterating maybe some aspects of the characters' experiences or their lives. You can retell some of that stuff like that, but you better find a new way to do it. Just because, if you do have, a readership that's going to continue on with the series, they don't want to read the same things over and over again, just being repetitious, so you got to find a new way to say it. That's your job, I think.
Well, I can't let you go without asking about dogs. Because and not to confuse, I don't want to confuse characters with the writer and that sort of stuff, but you tell us about dogs. I mean, obviously there's a connection there.
That was actually one of the things I was warned against. That was, whenever you start out, there's always a plethora of other writers that are more than willing to, give you advice, on what you should do and what you shouldn't do. That was one of the big pieces of advice I got was they said, well, don't give your protagonist any pets because then you have to try and, take care of those pets and you'll mess up and you'll do something wrong and everybody will be angry and all this stuff, and I thought, well, I've got a whole ranch full of animals that I've got to take care of. I don't see why Walt can't take care of one dog. It didn't seem like, and this kind of goes back to, that portion of the show where we were talking about, armed people talking to themselves. Basically I'm writing about an armed individual who, drives all over Wyoming, trying to, solve some situations like that in these cases. And I could either have him talk to himself or I could have him talk to the dog. And we all talk to our animals. Like it just seemed to me that made a lot more sense as using the dog as a sounding board. And I have to admit that, the dog has actually become, one of my favorite characters as I move along in the series like that, because he does have an understanding of Walt that maybe none of the other characters do. I think it was in Dark Horse, where, Walt got out of the truck and looked back at the dog and said, stay in the truck and don't play with the radio. And then he shut the door and walked away. And he says to himself, it was our own private joke. He knew he could play with the radio if he wanted to. Like it. And so it kind of like hopefully lends an element, to the books, where Walt is alone, but still, able to bounce some ideas off of, maybe the individual that's maybe the closest to him like that. And the dog was actually based off of a dog that I had, who's passed away, over the years like that. But he was, I rescued him from the pound in Sheridan. And it was only later that I discovered that he was part St. Bernard. He would go through about a bag of dog food every 2 or 3 days like that. But he became a wonderful character, for Walt, who I think, needs as much help, as he can muster, on a day-to-day basis. And one of the funner aspects of the books like that, because a lot of the humor, I think, tends to come from, the reactions that the dog has to Walt. And that for me just is, anytime anybody tells you you shouldn't do something, in a literary sense, I'm always enough of an outlaw that I'm always thinking, okay, well, how can I do this?
Of course.
And,
of course.
Having the dog in there, I remember people were telling me, oh, you can't change your location. Whatever you do, don't ever leave Wyoming. Well, third book takes place almost entirely in Philadelphia. The fourth book, half of it takes place in Vietnam in 1967. Depth of Winter almost entirely takes place, down in Mexico. I think, that goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about as far as like, growing and developing. I think it's important. The other one that I should finish up with, which was kind of funny, was the interaction between Walt and Vic Moretti, his transplant undersheriff from Philadelphia. There's a sexual attraction between those characters. And I remember starting off and all these other authors telling me that, well, you can have, sexual tension between your characters, but you can't have anything happen for like, 17 or 18 books. And my immediate response to that was, "What kind of women are you dating anyway?" Like, who would wait
Yeah, really.
17 or 18 years, for something to quote unquote happen. I was
That's
like,
a lot of sexual frustration. Yeah.
Exactly. Like I went ahead and had something happen in the third book, and I wrote my first sex scene, which is approximately 3 sentences long, which kind of gives you an indication of just how much of a chicken shit I am. And I wrote that scene. It was 3 sentences long, and I remember being on tour for it in Portland, like that. And there was a woman that wanted to ask questions at the very beginning, like that, and I was like, just let's wait till we get through, and then we'll do a Q&A. And she had her hand shot up immediately as soon as I finished up, and I said, "Sure, what's your question?" She goes, "I want to talk to you about that sex scene in Kindness Goes Unpunished." And I'm like, "Oh boy, here we go." And I said, "Yeah, well, what about it?" And she goes, "It went on forever." And I was like, it was only 3 sentences long. And she kind of turned bright red, and everybody in the room is laughing. And I looked at her and I go, "How many times did you read it?" And she goes, "I read it a bunch of times." And so I felt kind of vindicated at that point. I felt like it was okay. So
Wow. They looked into each other's eyes. They did it. It was good.
Well, like they use the Hemingway analogy. It's 7/8 of the iceberg is under the water, and that's all you need to know. So,
well, I'm kind of thinking that that's kind of a compliment, though. If she thought that the sex scene really lasted a long time, gave her a lot of satisfaction.
Oh, absolutely! Absolutely! If she was game, that's all I really care about, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and we actually should wrap it up because I've had you for an hour basically now. So, but Craig, you did great though. This is awesome. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you'll come on with Jim and I again when the new book comes out. Or I know you've got.
Absolutely! Just let me know, and we'll go from there. That'd be fantastic. So
yeah.
All right, guys. I will see you later.
Take care.
Sounds good.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.